Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Budding Solutions, a series on disease and pest management in cannabis sativa. My name is Kim Leonberger, and I'm an Extension Associate in the Plant Pathology Department at the University of Kentucky. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at Fusarium head blight, a disease that poses a significant threat to both cannabinoid or flower production as well as grain production. To discuss this important disease issue, I would like to introduce Henry Smith. Henry is a research analyst and PhD student at the University of Kentucky. He is a member of Dr. Nicole Gauthier's Extension Plant Pathology Lab. Henry has been working with hemp since 2019 and has authored multiple research articles and extension publications related to hemp production and Fusarium head blight. Welcome, Henry. I know you've prepared a few slides to share with us about this disease, and then we'll take some time for a few questions once you've finished.
All right. So first, let's see, there it goes. I'll start with a little bit of background on Fusarium head blight of hemp. This is a disease that has been documented since production returned in 2018 to Kentucky. And it is a disease, as Kim said, that is detrimental to cannabinoid and grain producers. It's not really a problem in fiber production, as this is a disease that affects floral tissues. And with fiber, we're not too concerned about the floral parts of the plant. Incidence has been documented in most hemp-producing states east of the Mississippi River. So we do have a fair amount in Kentucky. We've seen it in Tennessee, North Carolina as well. And we've really only documented FHB in field production. We have not seen any cases of FHB occurring in greenhouse grow operations. And to your right there, you'll see a quick image of what a grain plant that it's suffering from FHB looks like compared to a healthy plant. These are both the same cultivar. This was taken in one of our research trials this past year. So now specifically more about the signs and symptoms of FHB. It is a disease that is characterized by extensive necrosis of floral tissues. The disease typically originates from the interior tissues of dense buds. And during periods of high humidity or following rain events, you might be able to see white to red fungal mycelia on those buds. As you can see on the image on the right there, that's a cannabinoid cultivar that has a really bad case of Fusarium head blight. And this was taken a couple days after we had a big rain event. And then also on the grain side of things, if you harvest the grain from plants that are suffering from FHB, you may notice symptoms on the grain itself. The affected grain will often be brittle, lighter in color even, and it might have blue to black fungal bodies on the outer surface that is the fungal perithecia, a survival structure the fungus is making. And you may also see that white to red fungal mycelia as well, as you can see down there on the bottom right. So what's causing Fusarium head blight of hemp? It's caused by multiple species of Fusarium. Fusarium avenaceum, members of the Fusarium incarnatum-equiseti complex, Fusarium graminearum, and Fusarium sporotrichioides are the species we've identified that are causing Fusarium head blight of hemp here in Kentucky. And I've highlighted Fusarium graminearum in red, as this is the pathogen that is the most aggressive. In greenhouse studies, we've identified that graminearum causes the most severe disease. And through some survey work, we've identified as it being one of the most common causal species. And then also Fusarium graminearum poses a risk to growers too, via its capacity to make and contaminate floral and grain tissues with mycotoxins such as deoxynivalenol. If a grower is familiar with grain production and other agronomic crops, such as wheat and corn, they're very familiar with DON contamination. The FDA puts advisory limits on DON contamination in grain destined for human and livestock consumption. In cereals, it's 1 part per million for humans, 5 for swine, and 10 for cattle and poultry. Hemp grain is now approved for equine and poultry consumption here in Kentucky, but research still needs to be done to understand the extent of the mycotoxin contamination in hemp grain and how it might affect our livestock. And another thing about Fusarium graminearum It has a very vast host range, including common agronomic crops like I just mentioned, wheat and corn, and also grassy weeds such as orchard grass, panicum, and elemis species are all hosts for Fusarium graminearum. So now I'll talk a little bit about the life cycle of Fusarium and this disease. So to start, the fungus overwinters on crop residue from the previous season or also on its weedy hosts in the margins of the fields. And then in the spring, when temperatures reach about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the fungus will emerge from the residues left on the field or the weedy hosts, and it will produce spores, which are then dispersed by driving rain and wind onto hemp plants. And we've identified that senescent styles are one of the favorite uh, infection points, I guess I can say, for Fusarium graminearum. And these senescent styles appear following pollination and grain production or towards the end of the life cycle of the plant and cannabinoid production towards the end of the season. Around September, these senescent styles will appear. And you can see there's some fungal growth growing on those senescent styles. This is where the fungus really starts. It infects, and then it'll grow down into the interior parts of the bud, and you will see some disease, as you can see on the image on the far right, as the fungus continues to colonize. And when temperatures are moderate, 75 to 85 degrees typically, and when humidity is pretty high, usually above 90%, you can see symptoms appear as little as 5 days after infection. And then following this, after we have all this disease develop in the field, the process just restarts with the fungus overwintering in those infected tissues and reemerging the following spring. So how do we manage Fusarium head blight currently? We really have to rely on cultural management practices. And first and foremost, you can increase your plant spacing or reduce your seeding rates to give some more space in between plants so that following rain events, air can pass more easily in between plants and dry off leaves and floral tissues, reducing the time that those tissues remain wet and conducive for fungal infection. Also, along with that, plant cultivars with a less compact bud structure to improve the airflow within the heads. So I said that the disease typically originates from the interior tissues of dense buds, and planting varieties where the bud is not as compact and more spread out will allow for better airflow, more rapid drying following rain events, resulting in an environment that is not as conducive for fungal infection and growth. Also, using tillage. So, as I mentioned, the fungus overwinters in crop residue and within weeds. So, tilling to bury those crop residues from prior seasons and giving yourself a fresh field will help reduce the amount of inoculum in your field throughout the hemp growing season. And controlling those grassy weeds within and adjacent to your field plots. So you can see a grower even took it a step farther and is laying plastic out following their tillage to really help keep those weeds down and control that residue. And then also rotating away from host crops. So rotating away from hemp, cereals, and corn to a non-host for at least 2 to 3 years can help reduce your inoculum buildup in the field. And then currently there are not any chemical or synthetic pesticides labeled for hemp here in Kentucky. So growers do have to rely on biologicals and biorational products. But the efficacy of these commercial biologicals have not been determined when it comes to controlling Fusarium head blight of hemp yet. But there is some data out suggesting that these biologicals are effective at controlling corn earworm. So products such as BT-based or viral-based products such as Heligen can help control corn earworm, which in other pathosystems such as Fusarium ear rot of corn, controlling the insect pressure can also help control your Fusarium disease pressure. And we think there's a similar trend along with hemp because as these worms feed on these hemp buds, they're creating all these wounds on the plant that are prime real estate for the fungus to infect and colonize and start causing disease. So using some of these biologicals to control your worms is also a good management practice to help control FHB. And then also post-harvest management. So these causal Fusarium species can continue to colonize and grow on the floral tissues or grain post-harvest. So you really want to avoid harvesting diseased floral grain material to start. And also you want to make sure you dry it down really good before you put it into these big canvas storage sacks like you see on the image on the right, or you put your grain into storage. You want to dry your floral material ideally at around 60% humidity, and between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit is good. And then grain, you want to dry it down to around 8% to 9% moisture to ensure that there's not enough moisture in that grain for the fungus to continue to keep growing and colonizing while it's in storage. And you also want to avoid storing in warm or humid environments, which will just encourage fungal growth. And then lastly, you want to make sure you remove any disease plants that you identify during the drying or storage process. So in Kentucky, growers will often dry their cannabinoid hemp by hanging it in tobacco barns. And during those few weeks while it's drying in the barns, you want to make sure you're walking through and seeing if there's any plants where you see that white to red fungal mycelia growing. And if you see it, make sure you pull those plants out before you further process and store your hemp in these canvas sacks. So with that, I've included a few resources here at the end of the presentation. This is links to the UK Hemp Research and Extension website, which is where all the research we do in pathology, entomology, and agronomy, all the data from our trials are parked there. Also, I've included the link to the UK Plant Pathology Extension article webpage, where you can find a lot of useful information. And then also the KDA's list of pesticides approved for hemp here in Kentucky. So with that, I will wrap it up.
Great. Thank you so much, Henry. And that was really, really informative. So just a couple of questions for you. First, obviously, you spent a lot of time doing research on this particular disease. So if you would say that there's any areas that are lacking in research, what would those be?
I would say right now it's the mycotoxin side of things. When it comes to Fusarium head blight, we know directly how the disease can impact yields, but the mycotoxin side of things, we do not have a good grasp on. Hemp is a pretty complex matrix when it comes to trying to quantify mycotoxins in the tissues compared to things like wheat or corn. And methods have not been developed to accurately quantify mycotoxins in hemp yet. So we really don't know the extent of the risk that comes with these Fusarium species producing these mycotoxins, when and why they might produce these mycotoxins during the disease development process. So I think that's an area that we really need to direct some resources to and dig into the future.
Awesome. Yeah, that does sound like a really important area that still needs a lot of work. So you talked a lot about how this has a pretty wide host range. And because it does seem to affect a lot of those larger acreage agronomic crops as well, how do you feel that this disease will move in terms of importance as hemp expands?
Right. So I think as the grain hemp side of production continues to grow in acreage, uh, FHB is going to become a really important disease because this is a disease, as I mentioned, impacts wheat, corn, other agronomic crops that hemp is likely a rotational candidate for. Um, so with all of these crops being hosts for Fusarium, utilizing tillage is going to be very important. Leaving these residues on the surface of the field with all these plants being hosts, if we don't till every now and then, it's just going to result in a buildup of inoculum that's going to be detrimental not only to the hemp being produced in the fields, but also the corn and also the wheat. So I think it adds to the importance of using some deep tillage to bury residues as a cultural management practice.
Awesome. So one last question for you. So you have highlighted these resources here, but you also, I noticed in your bio, talked about that you've generated some extension publications. Would you want to talk a little bit about which specific ones you've generated?
Sure. So if you go to the plant pathology link that I've parked there, you'll be able to see we have multiple Fusarium head blight fact sheets, research reports, and disease alerts, where we go over some trials we've done looking at post-harvest Fusarium contamination. We've looked at survey. We have a statewide survey coming up that's going to be published there, looking at where we've documented Fusarium incidents in Kentucky, which species, the rates we've isolated them at. And then also we just have some good general management articles on there looking at how to store your hemp material, how to use good sanitation practices to prevent contamination of your material, things such as that. So I encourage you to go to that second link I'll put up there on the resources slide and really look around. We have lots of articles related to hemp production, Fusarium head blight in general, but also other diseases that might be of interest to growers.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Henry, and for sharing all this valuable information. Just a reminder to make sure that you check the description below the video. We'll have links there to all of these resources and a few more of those specific ones that Henry mentioned. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all on the next episode.